I looked down the table there, and I'm pretty sure they're not my team. It would be great if they really were. But anyway, for this morning, they are my team. So this is the kind of opening big picture session. And I was thinking about this because I was actually doing a bit of preparation in advance. And I was thinking, there's a lot going on, isn't there? And there's even more going on. We may be entering not just a period of climatic instability, but political, global instability, economic instability, and there's some interesting things going on domestically in terms of policy. So there is a lot going on. Maybe there's always a lot going on. Maybe whenever we do this, there's going to be a lot going on, but there's a lot to think about. So we want to cover some of these big picture things. We have got a stellar lineup for this morning. We're going to hear from, in a few minutes, Minette Batters, who's going to talk about some of the policy issues and some of the political issues, and some stuff about net zero, which she's been very heavily involved in. And then we're going to go over to James Dyke from the University of Exeter, who's going to talk about some of the impacts and drivers of climate change. And then we're going to hear from the guy down the end there, who is the reason we're all here, Harry Studholme, who is going to be talking to us about what some of this means for land managers, people doing stuff on the ground, in Harry's case, often trying to do farming in between trees. But we want to demonstrate that there is cause for optimism as well. So there's some things we need to be aware of, some challenges, but we've got some cause for optimism. So each of the speakers is going to talk for a few minutes, and then we can have a group discussion between us all. So think of your questions. So the first speaker then is Minette Batters, somebody who literally needs no introduction. Even so, I'm just going to do a little introduction. Just to remind you, in case you've been off the planet for a while, Minette was the first woman president of the NFU, a tough act to follow. She helped navigate the NFU through really challenging times, Brexit, COVID-19, Ukraine. Somehow she manages to do all that and farm and have a life, and now hangs out also in the House of Lords, where I'm sure she's going to be very effective. And it says of her farm, it includes beef, arable, and a few sheep. I've no idea how many sheep is a few sheep, but I'm sure it's a decent amount. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Minette to give us our first talk.
Is there a clicker for the... Thank you. Apologies. Well, what a huge treat it is to be here. I've only managed to get to Rootstock once, but I absolutely loved it. And it's very farmer-centric, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the sessions. I want to try, and I think it's fallen to me on behalf of Harry and Mel and the team at Rootstock, to try and sort of set the scene, because it's easy to think that we live in normal times. They couldn't be less normal, and we've been through a huge amount in the last 6 years, which will all have impact. So I'm going to try and colour... no, go back to that one. So my time, I mean, every president of the NFU thinks they had the toughest gig, and that's just how it is. And I'm quite sure that John Bradshaw right now thinks that I had a walk in the park. But it's just the way it goes. There is, Matt said it, there is always something going on, and we've been through a lot in the past, and we'll go through a lot in the future. For me, though, when I came in, Matt made the point about being the first woman. Rachel Reeves must be staring into this glass herself at the moment. If you are the first, you really do not want to be the worst. That's the first rule. And I can remember in the early days being told you're never going to command the same respect as a man. And in the first 6 weeks, I had someone come up to me and say, you haven't been on the Today programme yet. This is no good. You can't be president of the NFU and not on the Today programme. So there were a few things in the very early days that made me think, I cannot fail. This cannot be about failure. I got lots and lots of things wrong. But what I was, I guess, determined to do was to make sure that farming's voice was heard. And in order to be heard, to talk more about food and more about the environment. And the NFU is a solid policy, science and evidence-led organisation. but I really wanted the organisation to campaign more. And I think you can see how that is playing out now, how important it is to be able to campaign, how important it is to use the media to be effectively, you know, the eyes and ears of the public to influence government. That is the world that we live in now, and influencing and using the media is hugely important. And in the old days, I can remember when I was county chairman of Wiltshire, we were looking for news hooks. You don't need news hooks anymore, though we had news hooks aplenty with leaving the EU, the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the family farm tax, on and on it goes. Farming is newsworthy, but we hold the support of the public. And that is crucially important in all of this, that we don't use public support. You know, second to nurses as jobs that are most respected, that's phenomenal. And I hear a lot of people saying to me, oh, we need to get the public on board. They're on board, they're backing us, but it's a careful tightrope to walk. I want to just take you through a bit of the politics. So I worked with 4 prime ministers, 3 of them in 1 year. And I sort of, it's hard to believe. I mean, no matter what you think of Keir Starmer, and don't rule it out, anything could happen. But imagine if in 12 months there were 3 changes of prime minister. Let's just start with Theresa May, you know, the green Brexit, where we started the transition, if you like, from the common agricultural policy into the environmental land management scheme. The green Brexit, health and harmony, remember those days? Not actually that long ago. Our world was very different then, completely different to what it is now. Theresa May tried extremely hard to actually get the relationship with the EU that the Labour government are addressing now. So the Chequers deal was all about a sort of harmonised relationship and a gradual transition. I can always remember my first meeting with Theresa May and her saying to me, I had no idea, Minette, about SPS rules. That's phytosanitary rules on animal and plant health. And therein lay a very big problem, because phytosanitary rules, animal and plant health, have been a big part of the challenge with trade deals and our relationship with the EU. And that's what Labour will be looking to try and harmonise, because dynamic alignment has been very hard to define what that is. So the May era set the agenda. Very acrimonious between her and Johnson. And of course, as she left office, she laid down the legislation on net zero, which was very much to make life actually slightly more challenging for Johnson. More of that in a minute. And then the Johnson era. I mean, he was the most extraordinary person. If he were here today, you would all be in hysterics. He was very, very funny. He is very funny. As a prime minister, he was a nightmare to work with. He was like nailing the proverbial jelly to the wall. He would be cracking jokes constantly. I remember my first meeting again with him. It was COVID, so rule of 6. It was in his office, and he said, "Oh, you've come to badger me, haven't you? Ha!" And more jokes about badgers. No, we're not going to talk about TB today. We'll talk about that another time. But he was very, very difficult to pin down. And of course, he was determined to build on the green Brexit. So we were going to raise the legislation and the regulation for farmers in the UK, primarily in England, above the level of the European Union. It was all about having higher standards of environmental protection and animal welfare. And they did, and they set the legislation. So primary legislation doesn't come along every day of the week. I mean, primary legislation is once in 100-year stuff. So the Agricultural Act of 2020, the previous Agricultural Act, was in 1947. And alongside all of that, you've got the Environment Act, that again raised standards of environmental protection, put in place the Office of Environmental Protection, chaired by Dame Glenys Stacey, with a board of lawyers. So you've got a very high baseline now of legislation and regulation on what needs to happen with land use. The last time, actually, I saw Boris Johnson was at the Tiverton and Honiton by-election. We did a lot of by-election farm visits in that era. And literally his last words to me were, he put his hand on my shoulder as literally his car arrived and I was about to get a taxi to get a train. And he said, Minette, I am so sorry about Build Back Beaver. And if you remember, his party conference speech was titled Build Back Better. That was what it was all going to be. And Boris, as he always did, would rewrite speeches and titled it Build Back Beaver. And we have a lot of beaver enclosures. I have nothing personally against beavers, but it is really important that you have the right beaver in the right place. We talk about right trees. I mean, trees are one thing. Beavers are really important, that we do not have the wrong beaver in the wrong place. And we've got a lot of beavers in enclosures now. So that's going to be a challenge. And I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that you can change the government, but you are going to live with the legislation and the events of that time. So they also, in DEFRA, set up a species reintroduction committee, an animal sentience committee, so many different work streams. When you have that many prime ministers that are so different, they are going to do different things. Liz Truss, I don't really have time to do justice to Liz Truss. She was extraordinary to work with. My main criticism of her and Johnson, and it was collective decisions that they took together, were on trade. It was shambolic, appalling, and quite honestly a national disgrace to give so much, to give everything to Australia. The Australians never expected it. It might be fine. We might be fine, and it might not have impact. It might not be fine, but they gave away the one mechanism that we would have with the safeguard measures to be able to do something about it. And that's what was so wrong. She tried briefly to end the environmental land management scheme. She tried briefly to blame me for saying we wanted to go back to area payments. Plenty wrong with the environmental land management scheme, but we never requested going back to area payments. But she was short-lived. The life of a lettuce was it. And Ranald Jayawardena was, of course, her Secretary of State. And he, again, talking of timelines, he was one of 6 Secretaries of State that I work with. So that, again, for all of you now, if you have 6 different people, it's going to have huge impact. And imagine the civil servants in there when you've worked with all these different administrations. And when she had come out and said, we're going to end the environmental land management scheme, of course, that caused such disruption and so many explosions that, Ranald Jayawardena went in the next day and said, right, we're going to end the badger cull. And, his legal team said, no, Secretary of State, you can't do that. You cannot do that. But I say all of this to set the scene of where we are now. Rishi Sunak, life returned to a level of normality, but it was for a short space of time. He did do some important things. He put in writing that not now, not ever will we import chlorine-treated chicken or hormone-treated beef. And he had a food security summit, and he said he would set a target. So all positive when it got to Rishi Sunak, but it was, in many cases, too little, too late. Now, the one thing about this slide is that this picture was not taken very long ago, and we have all aged considerably since it was taken. So it's quite remarkable, actually. I don't like looking at it, because me included, we all look very different in 2022. The NFU is proudly apolitical, always has been, always will be. So we need to have great relationships with everyone, everywhere. And when I was there, I took it very seriously, and I've continued to take it seriously, because I would never have taken a political peerage. I would only ever have got involved on the crossbenches so that I could influence, because for me, it is all about moving the dial that bit further forwards and making a difference. So I had a good relationship with Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. They were actively interested in opposition. I never felt they had enough to say in opposition, and it's clear now that they weren't developing enough policies when they were in opposition. They did have 15 years to plan for now, but what we're seeing is lack of planning for actually being in government. A lot of issues, which I won't go into, happy to pick up in questions on the family farm tax and why that happened and how it's happened, and will things change? I mean, I saw Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, a couple of weeks ago, he's definitely very concerned, I think, about this. I think things could change, but they might not. Majority governments don't like to back down. And what you've seen with winter fuel payments, women's pensions, it feels to me very much like it did with trade and the Johnson administration. You know, we've done this, we're going to dig down, and we're going to stay where we are. But who knows, politics can change. We could have a new Prime Minister. You never know what will happen next. But what I wanted to talk about, having set the scene on the politics, how we've raised standards, we've legislated to achieve net zero by 2050, how do we find a way through this? And I guess I want to explain a bit why we made the commitment that we could beat the government target by 10 years. To hit net zero with the right policies, with the right incentives in place by 2040. Well, back in that, Matt, have I got another 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Back in that era, don't forget, another of the Secretaries of State was Michael Gove. And of course, he'd been part of the whole Green Brexit, part of the raising standards, absolutely behind the Office of Environmental Protection and everything else. And wanting a lot less meat. I mean, I don't know who was listening to the Today programme on the way down here, where now you can feed your dog lab-grown meat, but it is emerging. The Gove era was all about two things, lab-grown meat and vertical farming. He was absolutely wedded to the agenda. So the doors were shut to farming. Farming was deemed the absolute problem. And how did we break down the door? Don't forget, Gove also wanted to end the power of the unions and the trade associations. So we decided that we would say, and there were strong red lines in place, with the right policies, the right incentives, this industry can hit net zero. And it can. Some farms will be there now. Some farms will be on the way there. Some farms will never get there or necessarily want to get there. But I remind you of the legislation again. And the options are, do you want to be taxed or do you want to get there and be the solution? Well, I wanted, and the NFU still wants farmers to be the solution and doesn't believe they should be taxed or that we should downsize numbers because it's completely within the art of the possible. The great thing about saying that in 2019 was everybody did what we wanted them to do. They flung open the doors and said, well, how are you going to do that? That was the question you want people to ask, whether it's a climate change committee, whether that's politicians. Case of wine for Harry here at the front. And so having opened the doors, we were then able to go in and we put a farmer panel together across all commodities, across all land areas, and a scientific panel to benchmark that farmer thinking against. And this really has to be the road that we go down. I'm astounded that there isn't more of a focus, and there needs to be, on nitrous oxide over methane. All the focus has been on methane. It absolutely should be on nitrous oxide. And giving you, the farmers, the best access to the science out there, the optimization of food production, how we go from a synthetic relationship to a biological one, focusing on green manures. The absolute priority in all of that is baselining. My farm, I've just joined up with the Soil Exchange through Lloyds Bank. It's got to happen. It can't, I believe, happen at the farmer's expense. I think this absolutely has to be public funded, along with many other things. I know I'm out of time. I'd love to have started talking about my own farm, and apologies for talking about politics, but that was my brief to sort of set the scene on it. At home, we're tenants. We're a relatively small farming business. We grow spring barley. We have 60 spring and autumn calving suckler cows. We have a wedding venue. We grow British cut flowers. And we have a holiday cottage. And we are really, really busy. For me, and I'm sure for you, what I worry about most is we need to change and adapt as farmers. I'm into the SFI. You can see SAM 3 here. It's working well for us. But we are taking quite a chunk of the farm out of production. If those payment rates come down, which I'm very nervous about, that they will come down, we have to invest to receive. So that income forgone model is, I think, a real challenge for farmers as to what that's going to look like. And everything that I said before politically for Labour right now, you know, there will be enormous challenges on farming and profitability and how the department reacts to that. I was most nervous at the NFU of the delinking journey. We've delinked. The legislation is laid. We've delinked. That means other people now can access the fund. And if we do anything, there has to be a focus. If we're going to get food security as national security, we're going to have a level playing field with delivering for food and delivering for nature. Then we have to make sure that a budget is linked to farming so that 70% of land that is farmed can be delivering for all of this. If those monies fritter out and are just lost, it'll be really, really difficult to do it. I am sadly out of time and I need to stop there, but thanks very, very much for listening. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Minette, for a fascinating insight into, you know, PM roundabouts changing all the time and the other things. Interestingly, the last time we were both on the stage together, we were at Oxford Question Time, which is ever so slightly scary. And one of the questions was, should we, I can't remember exactly, should we abandon the 2040 target or set it back? And it was unanimous, no, we have to stick to it. It's not a nice to have, it's an absolute essential. And so I think that really helps set the scene for our next speaker, Professor James Dyke from the University of Exeter. James is an academic, he's a writer, he's assistant director of the Global Systems Institute, and his book, Fire, Storm and Flood, The Violence of Climate Change, came out in 2021. The title sounds great. I haven't read it, but I'm going to read it now I've read the title. Anyway, over to James.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I can't recommend the book. It's extraordinarily depressing. I wrote it during the end of COVID, and part of the motivation was to try to capture the world's worst wildfires, the world's worst incidents of flooding. And as I was writing this book, there were more wildfires, there were more floods. So I kind of drew a line under that, and I'm happy I'm not going to do that ever again. I'm going to talk about climate change, and are we on? I've got some slides to show you. So maybe one way to think about this is I'm going to pick up on some of the things that Minette was talking about with regards to the imperatives. Yes? I can see it over here. No, we're pretty good. Yeah. But we're not having it. Anyway, I'll keep doing the preamble. The motivations of the drives to essentially decarbonize. So what I want to talk about in the next, hopefully, 15 minutes is where we are with regards to climate change right now, how we got here, and what that means in the context of some of the challenges to... Okay, it's been a naughty laptop. It's got to go in. Okay, that's fine. And what that means in the context of farmers and farming. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is the fundamentally random nature of the weather, right? The stochastic processes and how climate change is changing variability. And in some respects, you are, you know, the leading experts in the UK when it comes to understanding chance and variability, because the entire process of farming, okay, is all about understanding when to plant, when to sow, when to crop, what kind of things to plant. So you have generations of kind of knowledge about the weather and what the weather does at different times. That knowledge is rapidly becoming out of date. And if we're not careful, it's going to be potentially useless given the new kind of climate system we're going in. So yeah, so from farm to fork in the road, and yes, I'm very pleased with that title. Changing food systems in a changing climate. So let's begin with the climate. Okay, I've got a video here. I'm going to get it started. It begins in 1979. And you will see these little dots on this line. These dots are research stations on this map here. What they're doing is they are monitoring concentrations of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, which is registered up on this axis here. This red circle, This is a research station at the top of an extinct volcano, Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And in 1979, it was recording 336 parts per million of CO2. Now, as the years go by, you'll see it goes up and down. This video is kind of nicknamed the pump handle, right? Because this are latitudes. So here's the South Pole, here's the equator, here's the North Pole. In the higher latitudes, in the Northern Hemisphere, in the summer, CO2 goes down, and in the winter, it goes up. The reason it's going up and down so much is, you think about where the equator is. Most of the Earth's land surface is to the north of the equator. That means in the Northern Hemisphere summer, when the trees grow their leaves and the flowers bloom, they are sucking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In the autumn and the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, when the trees drop their leaves and the vegetation dies back, that CO2 gets respired back out. So this up and down motion is literally the biosphere breathing in and breathing out. Now, if breathing in was the same as breathing out, then you would imagine concentrations would be constant, but you can see in the atmosphere over time, since 1980, it's been going up. It's been going up because largely humans have been extracting fossilized carbon in the form of coal, oil and gas. They've been burning it, and that concentration has been building up. We've got direct measurements of CO2 in the atmosphere since the late 1950s, this green line, and we can go back further. We can use proxy records. So the most important ones are ice core. Up in the Greenland ice sheet, Antarctic ice sheet, there is ice that's millions of years old. You can extract that, find little bubbles of air, and then reconstruct past concentrations of CO2, and therefore go back tens and hundreds of thousands of years. When we do that, we discover pre-industrial periods were a little under 280 parts per million. And when we go back tens and hundreds of thousands of years, at the bottom of an ice age, CO2 concentrations were as little as 185 parts per million. Now, this shows there's been very large changes in CO2. These changes, the top of an ice age and the bottom of an ice age, maximum glacial periods, that represents a change in global average temperatures of about 5 degrees Celsius. That's the difference between a world in which sea levels are about 40 meters lower than they are today. Also, these large changes happened over hundreds or even thousands of years. What we've done in as little as a century, we put a pulse of carbon dioxide. We've released about 2.5 trillion tons, which is geologically instant, and the Earth system is beginning to respond to that. The thing we focus on in the climate community is global average temperature. You can see it was roughly stable up until around the middle of the 20th century, and then it has been increasing. Last year was the first year above 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was actually a little bit above 1.6 degrees Celsius. That extreme warming continues, such that January 2025 was the warmest January we've ever experienced, and we're still waiting for, hopefully, temperatures to come back down to this red line. All that said, there is increasing evidence that the rate of warming is actually accelerating for a number of different reasons. You probably know about the 2015 Paris Agreement. Given that climate change has the potential to change everything, we need to limit warming at a certain level. It was agreed that's going to be 2 degrees Celsius back in 2015. Since then, it has been, next slide please. Since then, it's been understood that well below 2 degrees Celsius is actually 1.5 degrees. So the Glasgow talks in 21. So this is the idea of 1.5 to stay alive, right? We need to limit warming to no more than 1.5. Long-term warming is probably about 1.4 at the moment, and it's a matter of when, not if, we exceed 1.5. And I think it's also a matter of when, not if, we exceed 2 degrees Celsius. Next slide, please. So these averages mask an awful lot of variability. The land surface has been warming at least about twice as fast as the global average, because it takes longer for the seas to warm up, right? They're massive heat sinks. And we look at the warmest warming places in the world, certainly the high latitudes, the process of Arctic amplification. Just recently there was a heat wave in the Arctic where temperatures were about 20 degrees Celsius higher than the mid-20th century average. And some of the most extreme heat waves ever recorded have happened in Antarctica, where we've had temperatures 40 degrees Celsius higher than we would expect them, but also Europe. Europe is pretty much the fastest warming continent. Next slide, please. when I was growing up, the idea of 40 degrees Celsius being recorded in the UK was just unimaginable, right? But this is becoming the new normal. Next slide, please. If you hold up the little wireless thingy, I might even be able to drive it. I don't know if that's going to... Oh, I don't want to cause you too many problems. Anyway, look. So what we see is not only temperatures increasing, but if you order them, you can see that the hottest years are actually in... Oh, well done. Are you going to hold it up there for the entire talk? Good man. Right, so the warmest years ever recorded. The first one is 22, then it's 2019, 2003, 2022, 2020. The only thing we can be sure of, that the records will be broken at some point in the not too distant future. You can disaggregate, you can look down at temperature changes in most cities now. So for example, if you go to Show Your Stripes, you can see how temperatures in Exeter have changed, and we all have personal experience of that. We've been noticing it ourselves, and again, as farmers, you are acutely sensitive to changes in temperature. You are also acutely aware of changes in precipitation. Generally speaking, as the temperature, the global average temperature of the Earth goes up, you're going to see more moisture being held in the atmosphere. The hydrological cycle is going to run faster. Therefore, there's going to be more instances of heavy rain. So we'd expect to see, in some places, dry places are going to get drier, wet places are going to get wetter, but also we're going to see increased variability, and that can translate to more intense rainfall periods. I don't need to tell you that 2023 was extraordinarily wet. Here we've got like a heat map showing you in terms of percentage above the average, in some places 200% above average precipitation or rainfall. And that rainfall wasn't uniformly distributed across the year. In some instances, it was coming down in very, very intense rainfall periods. Now, that's nothing new, right? Some of you will remember the flooding of this place. This is Stoke Cannon, right? This must be 12 years ago now, I think. In some respects, we've got used to this idea that there will be flooding, there'll be disruption. It's only when you look at how these flooding events are changing over time that you can begin to discern the increasing trend. Now, major flooding events like this make the news because they will be disrupting infrastructure. Here we've got the main lines up to London being washed away. What perhaps doesn't make the news so much is the significant disruption of farming practices. So in some respects, we should expect to see more of this. This was a report from the BBC last year as a consequence of the extreme weather that we were seeing in 23, which was continuing in some instances with extreme rainfall in 24. This was just a kind of a randomly selected example of Robert Taverner, who talks extremely low morale within his farming community. He said, the winter's been incredibly wet this year, and it's been month after month of really wet weather. Talking to other farmers, they've never known a period like this. So this is perhaps the greatest threat that we've got to farming and farmers in the UK, in that the climate is shifting away from what we would expect it to be. That notion of variability is expanding such that the knowledge that we've had, the knowledge that might have been accrued through many generations of farming and farmers, just isn't really fit for purpose anymore. At the same time, as it's becoming very, very wet, it's also becoming very, very warm. We have a high density or proportion of dairy and cattle in the southwest, and we can see that this region, regards to an assessment conducted by the UKRI and the Met Office, is expected to see significant impacts as a consequence of climate change, in this instance because of heat stress for cattle. There will be periods in the years where cattle left outside, if they're not going to have some kind of adaptive management process, are going to be subject to potential, let's say, heat stroke, because there will be periods of very, very intense heat. So what this means is there are a spectrum of, in this instance, risks, opportunities, and benefits. So this is taken from a UK climate risk publication that tried to do some kind of synthesis around what climate change might present to the UK food system. I mean, I'm not going to go through them all, but just N4 risk to soils. If you have very dry period followed by an extreme rainfall, then you're going to see increased soil erosion. We're also going to see changes to pests and pathogens. One of the things we are observing as the climate is changing, we are seeing the distribution of species change. Species are beginning to migrate to higher latitudes. They're also beginning to migrate up to, let's say, higher altitudes. And that also includes things that we consider to be pests and pathogens. So we should expect novel kind of biological threats. At the same time, as the farming community, as farmers having to deal with the consequences of climate change, there is, as also Minette talked about, an increasing expectation that farmers are going to be part of the mitigation solution. So depending on how you measure it, the food production system or agriculture in the UK might be responsible for something like 10% of national greenhouse gas emissions. If we want to meet our Paris obligations, if we want to actually rapidly decarbonize, then food systems and farming has to be part of that. So there's going to be an increased expectation that farmers, not only will you be responding to a changing climate, and that also includes a change in political climate, but you also need to be part of the solution when it comes to the actual mitigation. Here is a recent article taken pretty much at random. I mean, not entirely random, because it's about grass-based finishing of beef, of which the Southwest is, that's an important kind of farming practice. They found that through different kind of management systems, management practices, you could, again, Minette was talking about nitrous compounds, so nitrification inhibitors or introducing white clover, or most importantly, anaerobic digestion of your manure, management of manure, could in that instance reduce emissions by 26%. So these are all kind of adaptive practices that are possible, and in some instances may be expected in the near future. What's really interesting about this paper, one of the things I found interesting, is it continued to talk about moving towards extensification by actual reductions. Because if you've got a certain amount of emissions from cattle, then maybe the quickest and easiest way to reduce those emissions is to have fewer cattle. But as they mention, or as they acknowledge, there may be unintended consequences for broader sustainability issues such as rural workforce and economies. The expectation that we can undertake the managed implosion of farming systems that might have been conducted for many generations, is probably a discussion which is, if not happening now, then will in the near future. Now, I've got 3 minutes to talk about the potential end of the world, which is climate tipping points. I'm just going to mention one. It's the Atlantic currents, the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. It's a vast transport of heat. We often learn about it in the school called Gulf Stream. Basically, it's why the British Isles are so much milder and warmer than there would be of other places at the similar latitude, because they're bathed in this warm water. There's increasing evidence that it's shutting down, that it might actually undergo a collapse. If that were to happen, it has been described as a global catastrophe because it would have a global impact on climate. But paradoxically, it means that the UK, Nordic countries, northeastern Europe, could become much, much colder. We in the UK could see much reduced rainfall in certain parts of the year, and also much, much colder winters. There was a letter written by scientists addressed to the Nordic countries, but it certainly applies to the United Kingdom, where they find the impacts on weather patterns, ecosystems, and human activities warrant further study, and they would potentially threaten the viability of agriculture in northwestern Europe. You could still grow things here, you could still plant trees, but they would not be the trees that you would plant previously, and they would not be the things that you would grow. It is a complete revision of farming systems in the region. So just to finish on time, there's this notion of resilience. And farmers need to be resilient. You need to be resilient because you're dealing with this random system. You need to be adaptive. But every adaptive system has its limits. We can't expect farmers and farming community to continue to respond to a rapidly changing climate and be part of the solution to reducing future climate impacts. We can't expect them to do that on their own. So this notion of chance and variability is in some respects taking the knowledge that has been generated through these many, many generations of farming systems and then using that in ways that can generate most robust policies to protect what we have, to continue to allow farmers to produce the food that we need at the same time as them being part of the climate solution. Thank you very much.
Is this on? Oh, yeah. Thanks, James. That was fascinating and really, really topical. So anybody who was listening to the Today programme this morning might have heard Professor Bob Watson talking about climate change, and he was basically saying, you know, we've smashed through 1.5. That's in the rearview mirror. We're it's probably not going to be 2. It might not even be 2.5. It might be 3. It might be 3.5. And so some of this stuff is happening now. And that point on resilience is really important. We did some work a few years ago. In fact, my colleague Becca at the back of the room on climate change in farming, and we tied it to extreme weather events, and we talked to farmers, and some of them said, you know what, we're resilient, we're farmers, of course we're resilient. We can bounce back after one event, but the problem is it's coming again and again and again, and you get drought, heat stress, then flooding, and then it starts all over again, and it's really difficult to adapt. So that was excellent. Okay, last speaker. Like I said, Harry doesn't need an introduction, but I am going to introduce him anyway because I like doing it. So Harry runs, I'm going to call them land-based businesses in the Southwest. He is former chair of the Southwest RDA, if you remember that. Those were the days. We can only hope for a return. And also, he's an honorary professor at the Centre for Rural Policy Research at the University of Exeter. If you are looking for a rural research centre, I can highly recommend the CRPR. I am slightly biased, as I'm one of the directors. Anyway, Harry, over to you.
Anyway, thanks, Matt. I can highly recommend the CRPR. It's a most excellent organisation. As introduced, I'm Harry Studholme. I'm somewhat of a hands-off regenerative farming. I do my best, but I'm not an exemplar. But as many people know, and Matt may have touched on, but I identify as a forester. And today I've really agreed to talk about trees, not because I think it's important in these discussions that some of the, at least one of the speakers sort of grounded in an activity that's going on in the space here between the farmland. And I'm not sure how this will go down, but I think we do need to talk about trees because they occupy 10% of Devon. Incidentally, that's about the same as it was when the Doomsday Book was written 1,000 years ago. They're not disappearing. Forestry has doubled over the last century. And we have a government that seems obsessed with planting trees, and the financial carrot to plant them has been growing year on year, and the Forestry Commission who are here can tell you more about that carrot. And environmentalists are generally strong supporters of this strategy to absorb carbon and increase biodiversity. But it's not a simple subject. And there are plenty of more nuanced and grounded views. And the most interesting part of all these sessions here is the conversation. So actually, I'm going to talk and kind of keep what I'm going to say as brief as possible to try to make sure that there is as much time to ask questions and have discussions. And please, don't worry about dumb questions, just ask questions because they create conversation. So in my brevity, I'm not going to talk much about tree planting. I plant about several thousand trees a year, but for me, putting trees in the ground is the easy bit. Managing those trees to survive and become productive over decades is the hard part. And I'm only going to touch on agroforestry because there's people here, speakers who are much better qualified. I've got hedges and infield trees providing shelter and wind for things. And I've also been experimenting with perennial cropping, planting a field with walnuts and having it grazed. The trees are doing well, as are the sheep. But I've no idea if it was a good idea or not at this stage. We're a long way from harvesting walnuts. And there are a lot of challenges to come, not least the battle with the grey squirrels, who will travel miles to gorge on walnuts. We're killing over 500 a year on this estate. It's sometimes gone up to about 700. And the little devils won't get the message. Still they come. It will not be easy. But what I will talk about is managing a forest that produces between 2,000 and 3,000 cubic metres of timber a year. Wood that goes to make things, from biomass to fencing to sawn timber for building and joining. And like with farming, it's essential to grow useful things on the land. We need it. We need it in these crises. There is a number of crises and we need raw materials. And like a well-run farm, it does provide environmental benefits, and that matters. And the look of the landscape matters too. But growing marketable timber is the lifeblood of the forest, as food production is the heart of a farm. And in the long run, the other benefits will only come if farms and forests have a productive use. If this works. There you go. The forest I run and the farm lies about as far from the west of Exeter as we're sitting from the eastern edge. The red is the boundary on the left, and the right of the sort of people watching a screen pictogram is West Point. The land is mostly steep, and consequently, much of it's been forested on and off for centuries. The flatter map bits, and that's a relative term in our case, and the more fertile bits are farmed. Farm has always been the preferred use for land, and it will continue to be. It's not an easy farm to run, which becomes quite clear when you look at this map, which was a map of my sort of BPS, similar to the countryside stewardship. The paler colours are farmland, and the dark green is forest. The better areas and the biggest block of farmland lies on the eastern side, with other bits of farm intruding into the forest or running around the outside. And the farm is run on broadly regenerative principles. I work with my marvellous neighbours. Simon Topless, I hope, is here today, who manages it. And the countryside stewardship and the SFI are giving me an opportunity to rest the arable soils of the farm with herbal lays. I've been sowing some of the areas with winter bird food, which interacts incredibly well with forests and produces a spectacular yield of songbirds, including a rich collection of red-listed species, which will happy for Natural England, so it's a very money well spent. And the sheep, incidentally, on the left of this slide, are grazing a 5-year-old walnut plantation, and the trees are protected by cactus guards, and the walnuts, I'm pleased to say, are doing well, but not producing enough nuts at the moment. Anyway, in contrast, the forest lies in the middle of the ground. The full mix of species is too fine-grained to see in detail, but the darker green is Douglas fir, about 37% of the forest. The pale green is oak-dominated woodland, about 28% of the forest. And the rest of the land is a mix of all sorts of species, including ash, which once upon a time was 11% of the forest. And it's an absolute nightmare what we do with this and how we replace it and how we find our way through regulations to produce something sensible. And there are many here, I realise, looking straight at Andy Neal, who will say that soils are the heart of everything. And in this case, they are. This is a soil map and of the land, and the forests all lie on the Culm measure soils, which are on the eastern left-hand side of the estate. And the trees are, the forests all lie there, and the trees on the red bits in the bottom right-hand corner are restricted to hedgerows, the occasional infield tree, and a plantation of walnuts. Our main marketable crops are oak and Douglas fir. And the oak, and this is kind of quite different timings to farming, it's taken the better part of a century to regain profitability after it was completely destroyed during the First and Second World Wars. And that is a pretty good example of what's happened across Devon, forests regrowing from those times. And I was lucky to have a grandfather who had the foresight to plant a bit of oak in places after World War I, and planted between the wars. Those young forests didn't have to compete with the mammalian pests of squirrels and deer, which we have today. I think it would be almost impossible to grow a similar forest now. I tried. The native broadleaves I planted 25 years ago haven't done well. The ash has succumbed to dieback, while most of the other trees are squirrel damaged. I wasn't going to show a depressing picture of squirrel damaged trees. Anyway, the Douglas fir I planted at the time is starting to break even. The This reinforced Douglas fir my father planted in the 1970s. They took about 40 years to come good, but they're now the backbone of the business. The forest is managed on what's called a continuous cover basis. Speaking as foresters, they're much less imaginative than farmers in developing catchy terms, and CCF is not catchy. But it works like regenerative farming alongside nature to harvest the natural surplus of the land. We mimic disruptions such as storm damage, although this year there hasn't been much need for mimicry. And we manage the light levels falling on the forest floor to encourage regeneration. These pictures of Douglas fir regeneration, oak regeneration, and those are, the next generation of what will be there. And at the same time, we work to create an uneven-aged forest whose structure is rougher for wind, and when it's disrupted, there are cohorts of younger trees in place to grow into spaces when trees are lost. But anyway, to turn to what James was talking about, climate change is an issue now. We're managing trees that will still be growing in the uncertain climate of 50 years' time. We're planting trees that will reach maturity in 100 years' time to face conditions very different today. So choosing what we plant is absolutely critical. We can't know the future, so we're hedging our bets by increasing diversity of species. So this slide shows a few examples. There's western red cedar on the left-hand side, a quick-growing tree with durable timber from Western Canada. It's a lovely tree, I love it. And on the right-hand side is tulip, particularly attractive tree from the east coast of the US. And in fact, that particular tree is well adapted to what James talked about AMOC, because the probability, if there was an AMOC collapse, is we'll get these really cold winters and hot summers, much more like the continental climates of the US. So what we need to be thinking about is trees that can survive in a whole range of alternative scenarios. The little bit of tree in the middle is Dutch elm disease-resistant elm. Because disease, and this is one of the most worrying consequences of climate change, is probably the biggest problem. It'll be one of the biggest problems for agriculture. As with rising temperatures and more frequent drought, trees become stressed, crops become stressed, and they're more vulnerable to infection. Insects are moving north and west from southern and eastern Europe. At the same time, fungal diseases start to turn on at higher temperatures. So at 24 degrees, sooty bark disease in sycamore suddenly becomes a huge problem for us. And the ways that we can respond, and there's a couple of ways that we can respond, is to plant a wider palette of trees, and another is to try to breed disease resistance. The former is quite quick to do, well, in tree terms, and the latter a slow process. The little thing on the left-hand side is Dutch elm disease-resistant elm, and we know about the disease resistance of elms. We just don't have very nice-looking elms that are resistant, or nothing like the elms that we were used to 40, 50 years ago. But ash is possible, and practically we can do it, and we're on the journey. Oh, we're nearly there anyway. That's good. Finally, I did want to touch on soils and trees and carbon, because everybody knows that trees mitigate carbon dioxide emissions. And this is an example. I've been sampling my forest. Where's the picture? There's a soil. Sampling my forest every year for the last few years, and my farmland, to try to build up a picture of carbon across the estate. And what I've been particularly interested in is the soils under the trees, because everybody seems to know about what's going on in farmland. I mean, the people here will tell you all about that. But the soils under the Douglas fir and how they compare to the oak have been particularly interesting. In the middle, there's Douglas fir that's about 50 years old, and on the right-hand side, there is oak that's about 100 years old. The oak is yield class 4, producing about 4 cubic metres of timber per hectare per year, and the Douglas fir about 20, yield class 20, producing 20 cubic metres a year. It grows quicker, it's absorbing above ground, it's absorbing carbon more than twice as fast as the oak. It's got a lifespan as long as oak. It'll last 600 to 1,000 years. In a CCF system, it could be storing carbon for as long as longer. So what interested me was what it looked like below ground. And this slide shows a summary of the results. Nothing on the farmland side of this slide would surprise carbon experts. We average about 100 tonnes of carbon to the hectare, down to 30 centimetres. Permanent pasture holds more than the arable fields. The culm more than mineral red soils. The best plot, stream side. Permanent pasture on culm soil at 159 tonnes per hectare, down to 30 centimetres. That's 6 lines from the bottom. The bit that I think is fascinating is the forest measurements. And the carbon in the soil under the Douglas fir is about 20% or 20 tonnes or so per hectare higher than under the broadleafed oak. It may be to do with the acidity of the soil. But this, and I haven't adjusted my slides, but this is very immaterial compared with the differences above ground. The Douglas fir, the 100-year oak, is got about 158 tonnes per hectare above ground. The 50-year Douglas fir has about 220 or 230 tonnes per hectare. So it would be crazy to be planting purely broadleaves if you're trying to absorb carbon. And finally, to me, to say, both the forestry and the farming and everything else on this estate are intertwined. They're not in tension. Both are productive uses of the land. And to survive on the land, what we need, and Minette gave a great example of this, is a diverse strategy. Having several enterprises exposed to different markets. And one of the ways I think that farmers are very good is their adaptability. It's their ways of looking at things in different ways. And today we'll hear from people who are doing different things on the land. And the way we need to work to respond to the climate change that James has raised is actually by that adaptability, by that diversification. And it is that adaptation to it that is as important as the mitigation aspect. What we need to be doing at the same time, we're speaking an awful lot about mitigation, about net zero, but at the same time, we need to be working out what we do about it, how we exist in this brave new world. Anyway, I think it's much more fun having people to talk about this from the floor rather than me bang on about my own prejudices. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Harry. So hopefully those 3 talks that are different yet linked help set the scene for the rest of this session and for the day, because this is a lot of the context that other talks fit into and that you all operate in. So we've got until about 15:15 for a discussion, okay? So when I say a discussion, that means, I know you've all been to these sort of things before, please don't make statements. Ask a question of our panel and we'll have a 2-way conversation. Put your hands up when you want to speak. I've got the glasses that I can see to the back of the room so I can actually see people now. Do feel free to say who you are, where you're from, but don't make a long statement, ask a question, and then we can have a discussion, okay? Don't all put your hands up at once, but you, sir, were first. Oh, unless there was another one. I can't look in both directions at once. Okay, we'll go there, then we'll come to you second.
Good evening, afternoon, morning even. It's already been a long day. Right, first of all, I'm Bob Priest. I farm up near Holsworthy and Bude. We're an AHDB monitor farm. We've done 2 carbon audits. One said I was carbon negative, one said that I was carbon positive. Very frustrating. What system for us farmers do we use going forward? And what system should every industry use going forward? We get an Amazon delivery that says it's CO2 negative delivery, which we all know is complete.
Thank you for that question. I don't know if anyone on the panel is brave enough to want to go first to answer this.
Yeah, I've got some views, but you go first.
I think does have an on-off switch. Anyway, I'll talk into this. I think it's a fundamental question. There are a range of carbon monitors out there. I think anybody who's filled out the forms for one of these things will know that there are an awful lot of boxes and there are an awful lot of imponderables. And there is a very serious problem about consistency. And so for me, the only thing to do is to try to be consistent and try to understand what sits behind these models. I don't think there is a best model at the moment. I think you just have to go with one. I think in your case, I'd go with the one that says you're carbon negative from a business point of view. But in reality, I think we all sit there thinking, you know, so how much of this is genuinely true? Are there other bits and pieces that are externals that we're not monitoring? It's particularly true as a forester. I'm very conscious that, you know, the level of forest, the level of timber that goes off the estate is actually storing timber. I don't get any credit for it. It's storing carbon in roofs and things. But on the other hand, I'm probably using much more carbon than I imagine, as you say, in these Amazon deliveries. And I don't trust the fact that they're buying somebody else's carbon to make them carbon negative or carbon neutral. So it is a complicated equation. There is no easy answer. Just take the one that works best for you, I think, at the moment.
I'm conscious of the time.
Well, if you've got something quick.
Well, just no, therein lies the challenge. Bob, you just highlighted exactly why, you know, we cannot carry on with all these different carbon calculators. But I think my bigger worry, though, is the desktop, the Amazons of this world that are using a desktop analysis as opposed to the practical one. And, you know, everybody talks about the opportunities of the carbon market, but it just does not exist. So we've got to establish an accounting framework for it, and we can't establish that unless we know what's happening. So I absolutely agree with Harry. You know, whatever you are doing, continue doing it. We need to measure the baseline, but I do think government has a fundamental role, and I can see John Gilliland very keen to speak. I mean, Northern Ireland should be applauded for what it has done with measuring the baseline and government's ambition there. But I'm conscious of time,
So quick comment from James, then I've got some people that want to come in. I will come back to you for your question. I won't forget.
Yeah, so many of my students end up working in consultancy, and they're doing these kind of baselines for different industries, scope 1, 2, and 3. It continues to be a wild west. There's lots of different methodologies, there's lots of different companies, there's lots of different tools. Over the last couple of years, we've seen the confidence of the carbon removal, carbon credit, voluntary markets, just the confidence has completely fallen out of that market because an awful lot of what was being proposed as carbon removal is just fantasies, basically. So it desperately needs regulation. The United Nations, through the IPCC, have kind of realised that, and they're beginning to mandate how we're meant to measure carbon and how it's meant to be moving around, but it's very early days.
Thanks. So, Charlie, was your point indirect? Okay, I'll come back. John.
So I'm John Gilliland. I'm an advisor to AHDB, and you'll hear a little bit about my journey after coffee. I just want to come back on this question. I sit in DEFRA's Food Data Transparency Partnership, where this issue has been absolutely front and centre. And a year ago, 18 months ago, in fairness to DEFRA, they funded ADAS to do a review. There's 62 different carbon calculators out there at the last count. 7 stuck their head up and came forward. ADAS got the contract, and March last year, ADAS published a report on calculators. And the general feeling is we need a conversion towards one calculator. 3 of those 7 calculators are now in talks to converge. In my own part of the United Kingdom, we've made a collective public and private decision we're going to one calculator. And our government is procuring that as we speak. And we're going one step further. It will not only be a calculator for reporting to Scope 3, it will also be the same calculator reporting to the Greenhouse Gas National Inventory. So we look to answer to both customers in this journey and not one alone. So watch this space. Really pertinent question, and thanks for it being asked.
Thanks for that. So we're going to go to the seaweed guy. Sorry, I don't know your name. And then after that, we're going to go to Charles Courtney. So if we can get a microphone over there. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Dale, the seaweed guy. I was just, it wasn't, I don't know if it was a great question, but I was just wondering how you pick out the trees in your continuous cover farming for, whether you pick out ill trees or old trees or how you regulate your cycle. Thank you.
Right, at this stage, we're picking out the poorer performing trees. But also it's a sort of combination of things. It's a kind of more art than science, really, thinning a plantation, because what you're trying to do is to manage the light levels that are falling on the forest floor, while at the same time trying to improve the genetic composition of the forest. So you're taking out the poorer performing trees, but at the same time you're looking at the spaces between the trees to work out how the whole matrix of the forest fits together.
Thank you. I did think it was like a cheetah hunting a gazelle, ill trees and all that. But yeah, anyway, thanks.
Thanks. Charles, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Charles Courtney from Powderham, and a colleague of Minette up in Westminster. So we've talked a little bit about Net Zero 2040. We've talked with James around adaptation to 2 degrees or more. Harry, you've talked about Douglas fir being great for Net Zero, but obviously oak and broadleaf will be much better for biodiversity, which is the alternate and perhaps more important crisis. We have a land use framework just introduced, and I wonder if the panel could comment upon the land use framework and the way in which we as land managers can possibly meet all of these diverse tasks which have diverse solutions and can't be achieved, obviously, with a single programme.
Can I first of all heartily reject your perspective on Douglas fir? I walked through mine this morning, and the birdsong is absolutely deafening. It is a deeply held prejudice which is utterly wrong. That there are a large number of species that thrive in conifers. Conifers have been around far longer than broadleaves, and in particular, I have goshawks, crossbills, a whole wide range of tits. The deer damage being created underneath my Douglas fir is quite significant, and there are mammalian species in there as well, and frog spawn in the ponds in between. So I think that's absolute tosh, if I'm not saying so. But yeah, but you said a monocultural oak woodland was the alternative. I mean, I think the point is that you can create diverse woodland as conifers or oak, but the Douglas fir too has a wide range of species coming into it. So I think it's still wrong. But anyway, on the land use framework, it's going to be an interesting opportunity because it's such a complex subject. The benefits of top-down management of the land are challenging. I think we already have a massive collection of things telling us what to do on different pieces of land, and so maybe one of the challenges of creating a land use framework is at the same time as trying to create a framework as to try to rationalize many of the existing conflicts, and that's going to be, I think, somewhat of a journey. But I haven't yet read in detail the document on a sort of line-by-line basis, so I feel ill-equipped to comment. Well, Minette may well have read it.
Well, I'm not an expert on Douglas fir, so we'll move on from there. Charlie, I mean, great point. There are 3 fundamental pieces of work that are now going to come out for consultation and, more importantly, need to be delivered on: the land use framework, the farming roadmap, and the comprehensive food strategy. Remarkable that it's taken so long. We had the Henry Dimbleby work. I was on his advisory board. That's been shelved. So we're a long way on, and yet no further down the road. My worry with the land use framework, and it's interesting that DEFRA are not looking at legislation at this point in time, is because it is so challenging. But with these legislated targets, we've got legislated targets now on tree planting, on water quality, on air, on net zero. They've got massive proposals for renewable energy and housing. And we've got a finite and fast decreasing amount of land. They've got warm words on food security, but no target for food. And my concern always with no target for food and all these other targets is within the national planning framework, if you have no target for food and you have targets for everything else, food gets left out. So whether you're looking at, slurry storage, new buildings, whatever you are looking at within the rural economy, it's going to become the poor relation. I passionately believe that they need to move on from biodiversity net gain to nature, food, and biodiversity net gain. It's remarkable to me that I can go to Kenya for Farm Africa with an ambition to plant trees, but they are prioritising food-producing trees that can not only sequester more carbon, but can obviously feed people as well. In Africa, understandably, there's an agenda for that. It's appalling that we haven't moved on. We should be able to join up urban and rural areas, be able to have more communities having more say, more allotments, really integrate rural and urban. And I think with the ambition for housing, that could be a real game changer. So the government has a huge amount that it can do, should do within the land use framework. I worry if it doesn't do it, farming will not feature where it should in it. The focus will be on delivering for GB Energy, and that will be wrong and a massively lost opportunity.
Just to say that we definitely need integrated land management processes and policies. And the only comment I've got is regards to the net zero component. Those policies and approaches need to be adaptive and agile because we're going into a non-analog climate. And some of the assumptions we're making about the sequestration of carbon in either soils or trees might just prove to be wrong because we're already seeing some soils, some forests, some land-based ecosystems become carbon sources. So the carbon is becoming to come out as those soils get warmer and drier. So we have to have adaptive policies that are going to be resilient to the changing climate that unfortunately we've kind of baked in already.
Thanks. So I was thinking maybe next year, rather than having the conference, we just go straight into the Battle of the Estates, because I think we could definitely sell tickets for that. I'm sure we can keep discussing that. It's interesting on the land use framework, we were discussing it only yesterday actually at work, and one of the things that I've not read it yet, but apparently one of the things that's in it is about the importance of advice. And I think, and it goes back to that first question about, there's all these tools, which one do you use? Well, it's really important that we have advice free at the point of delivery to the land managers, farmers, foresters on the ground to help negotiate and navigate your way through this labyrinthine kind of demands for various different things, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's climate change, whether it's actually food, whether it's all the other things that we need. We always just ask more and more and more of farmers, and if we want them to deliver, I can see you here all eager to do that, then we need to provide all the tools for that. That includes rewarding people financially and having the advice networks. Anyway, you're not here to listen to me. Who's got the next question? Over there, sir.
Thank you. It doesn't matter, I'll just shout.
Yeah, go on, shout.
Sam Walker, I'm a tenant farmer down the road. James painted a fairly alarming picture of carbon and future heating of the world. Are we doing our best, worrying about our cows and sequestering carbon, while people are digging up more and more fossil fuels, while the Americans are drilling baby drill? Are we doomed to failure, like someone trying to bail out a bar, taps on the plug-in?
James, do you want to go first then?
What we do is necessary, but it's not sufficient, right? The number of times I'll give a talk and somebody says, "What about China?" Okay, yeah. What about China? China is also leading the world with regards to the production of renewable energy systems. Electric vehicles, electric batteries, solar. Every different nation, every different community has got its part to play. With regards to what might be happening across the Atlantic, I don't want to even get into that right now. It's going to be extraordinarily challenging. But our best practice, and the way in which you can describe it in the context of the United Kingdom, the UK led the world into the Industrial Revolution. We have everything in place that we could lead into a greener revolution, and we could demonstrate that we could grow food. We could have sustainable livelihoods for farmers at the same time as securing food security, improving biodiversity, this integrated approach. We can do it, so we could demonstrate what's possible. It's not our responsibility to impose that on other nation states, but certainly if we can demonstrate that we can walk the talk, then it's got to make it easier for other places to do likewise.
It's a really good question. I don't for myself, I don't despair in any way at all. One, I would say, and looking at James's pictures in a warming climate with AMOC collapse, we're very well sited here. If we've got a mixture of cooling and warming, it could be a lot worse than to be in a purely warming area. And the move is likely to be more of a, if the AMOC collapses, we go to continental climate. So the first thing is, one doesn't need to get too depressed about the long term. I mean, I'm saying as a world thing, it may be heading to calamity, but Devon may not be as bad a place to be living. I think that's point one. Point two is the timescales of things to think about. So, what is being looked at, forecast there is quite long term. We're looking at, particularly as foresters are worrying about 50 to 100 years' time, but as farmers, we're looking at the best next season. And as maybe if we're very, very foresightful, we might think of 4 or 5 years' time. And that's much less a change. And you do need to think about things, because things will be changing gradually over time. We're not going to the world's not going to come to an end. The people are going to carry on existing. We may get more and more stories of wildfires in Canada, etc. We may have some pretty terrible stuff with us, but we are resilient. We are people who will adapt and will respond. And in the short term, things like knowing the rainfall is likely to go up means that we need to be thinking more carefully about how we protect our soils, and how we put bigger guttering on our new farm buildings when we build them, bigger culverts under our roads when we put a culvert in. We need to be conscious of the increasing rainfall, and we need to be thinking every season how we are responding to the changes. So I think the world is not coming to an end. The world is going to carry on existing. It may become tougher. It may become that we have to adapt to it and we have to do things with it. But I don't despair too much. I mean, it's bad, but
Can I just very quickly come in? I was on a panel last night for Trinity Grain, and actually the chairman said, right, now, if you were Donald Trump, what would you do? And actually it was really great fun being Donald Trump, and what would we do? So I think it does make it tough here when all the legislation that I talked about, and you've got a complete reversal of everything going on in the States. But there are some interesting things going on that I think give a lot of hope in America, and to your point, James, on other countries are doing great things, but we're not necessarily bringing it together. So they are measuring a lot about what they are doing, and they are putting a lot of resource into that. What I worry about in that budget, we all focused on the family farm tax, but there were some other alarming things, and most particularly the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the Treasury is focusing on, whereby they are just looking at measuring our inputs effectively. So specifically, as an example, would be nitrogen fertilizer. And there is a real danger globally now that actually consumption of emissions goes up. So, we could produce nothing, emit nothing, problem solved. And that's the real danger. So globally, we really have to come together. We're not even agreed it at a UK scale, let alone a European scale, let alone a global scale. But we have to have this accounting mechanism that works. Otherwise, I think it's going to lead to consumption of higher emissions. The UK, if every dairy cow was efficient as a UK dairy cow, we'd only need 72 million. We'd lead less than half, effectively, of what we've got now. So, that has to be the focus, I think, going forward.
Thanks, Minette, and the others on the panel. So, if I was Donald Trump, the first thing I would do would be change the colour of my face. That would be a first place to start. But despite what he thinks, he is not going to be around forever, and we still need to keep doing the right stuff. But, things might get a bit more challenging. Right, we have time for one more question, or more important, one more quick question, but more importantly than that is the answers need to be fairly quick. Sir, at the back, your hand went straight up.
Hello, Mike Roberts, a beef farmer from Cornwall. This session is called The Big Picture. Just wondered, why is it never mentioned about global population? Because surely that should be the big picture. I realise everybody seemed to enjoy the increase in global population, one way or another, but wonder what your ideas are, please.
So I don't know if we have any population experts here, but I mean, what's going to happen to the population globally is it's growing, but it is going to plateau. And we know in this country, we have a declining birth rate. So there are complex patterns. I'm saying all this now to be building time for people on the panel to be thinking of a good answer.
I could talk about the standard demographic model if you like.
There you go.
But
yeah.
So the global population continues to increase, but its rate of increase is going down. The fastest it grew was when I was being born in the 1970s, and since then it's been slowing down. The reasons are complicated, but essentially as people become richer and you keep women in education for longer, they have smaller families. And that's a process that we see unfolding as more and more nations become, let's say, more economically developed. The greatest increase in the population are in places like sub-Saharan Africa. But when it comes to the climate crisis, these people have the very smallest impacts on the climate. It's a relatively small fraction, about the 10% of the world's richest people, of which I'm actually a part of. I don't feel like particularly rich, but I'm certainly in the global population, I'm in that 10%, they're responsible for over half of the amount of CO2 emissions. So population per se isn't so much a problem. It's more a question of how do we transition those nations in a way which they don't follow our kind of fossil fueled mistakes. Because what we can't have is another 4 or 5 billion middle class people, because we completely destroy any carbon budget that we've got. So that's where in some instances, we need to really focus our efforts on decarbonising and making sure that we don't build new infrastructure, which we're just going to have to decarbonise at some points in the future. And I just want to say that the UK could do much better in that respect. We continue to build houses with gas-fired boilers in them. Within the next 5 to 10 years, they're just going to be replaced. So once again, I just urge the UK to take a leadership role in this, and perhaps it's not so much about population change, but more consumption and emissions change. Thanks.
Thanks. So I'm going to have to draw it to a halt there. If there are any members of the media in the room, the headline is not "we need to get rid of the middle classes," okay? It's "we need to do things differently." Thank you for being such an engaged audience and having so many interesting questions. Thank you very much for our panel, Minette, James, Harry. Hopefully this has been a good start to what's going to be a great day. We know one of the really important things about events like this is coffee breaks and lunch breaks. So there's plenty of time now for everyone to get a drink, get refreshed and chat to people. So thank you very much. And, over to Andy.
And we start again at 11:40, so please be back at about 11:35. And the most important thing that I forgot to say earlier is thank you so much for our sponsors who enable this to be an affordable event for all of you to come to. So that is critically important, is thank you very much for our sponsors. But do come back at 11:35 because we want to keep going and keep our momentum up. Thank you.